He was blamed for the accident, but the camera revealed the shocking truth. The city carried a golden glow that afternoon, the kind of warmth that made everything feel slower, softer, almost safe. The sun sat high, its light spilling across windshields and bouncing off tall buildings. Traffic rolled steadily along the wide street, a symphony of engines, horns, and footsteps weaving together into the rhythm of daily life. Children laughed as they pedaled their bikes on the sidewalk, their tiny wheels spinning quickly, while a man at the corner pushed a cart of roasted peanuts, the scent drifting into the air. Nothing seemed out of place. It was just another ordinary day. Daniel's sedan blended almost invisibly into the stream of cars. Modest and slightly worn, the vehicle wasn't the kind to turn heads, but it was steady, much like the man behind the wheel. Daniel, in his early 40s, sat upright, his hands resting carefully on the steering wheel at the exact 10 and 2 positions, the way he'd been taught years ago. His shirt sleeves were rolled neatly to his elbows, the fabric faintly creased. From a long day's work, the faint hum of the radio filled the space, playing a tune from an old R&B station, and Daniel hummed along. Low and steady. It wasn't joy exactly, but something gentler contentment. He had finished his shift, the weight of labor still clinging to his muscles, but there was a certain peace in simply driving home. The familiar roads, the afternoon light, the sight of people going about their lives, these small details grounded him. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who needed much to be satisfied. A safe drive, a warm meal waiting at home, and maybe a phone call from his sister to check in, that was enough. Still, even in this contentment, Daniel drove with the sharpness of a man who knew the world didn't always forgive mistakes. Every mirror glance was deliberate. Every slow press of the brake was measured. He was never the one to speed past yellows or cut corners just because no one was watching. Too many times in life, he had learned the price of being judged for things he hadn't done, of carrying blame that wasn't his. Behind the wheel, he refused to give anyone that chance. The sedan glided through the streets at an easy pace. The steering wheel felt firm under his palms, and Daniel held it as if it were something fragile. His gaze shifted calmly from the road ahead to the mirrors, scanning, checking, making sure. When the light turned yellow a block ahead, he slowed. Long before it shifted to red, the cars behind him adjusting with small grumbles of their brakes. He didn't mind. He wasn't in a rush. Safety, after all, was its own reward. Outside, the sun caught the glass panes of shops and windows, scattering patterns of light across the asphalt. Pedestrians passed, some carrying shopping bags, others walking dogs tugging at their leashes. Daniel took it all in through the quiet focus of a man who had spent years paying attention, not only to the road, but to people, to moments, to signs that most others would miss. He had learned that life often whispered before it shouted. As the sedan rolled past the children on their bikes, one of them stumbled, the wheel wobbling dangerously close to the curb. Daniel's hand tightened on the wheel, his foot hovering gently over the brake. But the boy steadied himself, laughing with his friends, the danger gone in an instant. Daniel let out a small breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Caution was second nature to him. Instinct built from both discipline and necessity. For Daniel, the car was more than metal and wheels. It was a promise he made to himself each time he turned the key that he would not become reckless, that he would not give the world an excuse to write him off as careless. Every measured turn of the steering wheel, every cautious glance in the mirror, was his quiet rebellion against a world too quick to judge. The city moved on, alive in its noise and motion, unaware of the storm waiting just beyond the next intersection. For now, everything was calm, everything was ordinary. And Daniel drove on, careful as always, never knowing that within minutes, the peace of this golden afternoon would shatter. The city's golden calm lasted only a heartbeat longer. Without warning, a sharp gleam of red streaked into view from a narrow side street. A glossy sports car, polished to a mirror shine, burst onto the main road as though the rules of traffic didn't exist. The low growl of its engine roared like an animal breaking free from its cage. It was moving too fast, far too fast for the quiet order of the afternoon. Daniel's eyes snapped toward the blur. His instincts fired, his foot hit the brake. His hands tightened on the wheel, but the distance was too short, the moment too sudden. The shriek of rubber scorched the air. Tires screamed against asphalt, an ugly tearing sound that clawed at the ears. And then, with a violent crunch that shattered the fragile calm, metal slammed against metal. The world turned sideways. Daniel's sedan spun sharply, the jolt slamming his shoulder against the door. Glass fractured into glittering shards, cascading like rain as the car whirled once, twice, before finally careening into the curb. The seatbelt bit into his chest, holding him in place as his world stopped moving. The silence that followed deafening in its contrast. For a breathless moment, everything seemed suspended, dust hanging in the air, a child's scream in the distance, the metallic tang of wreckage sharp in his nostrils. Daniel blinked hard, his pulse thundering in his ears, trying to register what had just happened. The steering wheel shook under his trembling hands, its once reassuring grip now foreign and fragile. Outside, the city paused. Pedestrians froze mid-step. Conversations halted. The crash had sucked the air out of the street, leaving only stunned silence in its wake. Daniel coughed, glass crunching beneath his palm as he steadied himself. His car, dented and scarred, sat wounded against the curb, its modest frame crushed. At the side, he took a shaky breath, relief flickering for a moment. He was alive. Bruised, rattled, but alive. Then came the slam of another car door. From the gleaming sports car, its hood crumpled like paper, a figure emerged with startling force. A young man no more than his mid-20s stepped out, his movements sharp and theatrical. His tailored jacket was spotless, his shoes polished, his hair styled with precision. Wealth clung to him like a second skin, and so did entitlement. His face twisted in fury as he pointed directly at Daniel. "You! Are you blind?" he shouted, his voice cutting through the thick air like a whip. "You came out of nowhere. You crashed into me." Daniel, still catching his breath, lifted his head slowly, his vision clearing from the haze. He opened his mouth to speak, but the young man's accusations poured on, louder with every word. "I had the right of way. Do you even know how to drive? Look at what you've done." The man bellowed, gesturing wildly at his ruined sports car, as if the dented metal were a greater tragedy than the shaken man in front of him. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the noise. Whispers floated among them, murmurs about the wreck, about the cars, about who might be at fault. And though no one had seen the moment of impact clearly, the sight of the wealthy young man, sharp and confident, seemed to tilt opinions before. A single fact had been spoken. Daniel sat still, the seatbelt still tight against his chest. His heart hammered, not just from the shock of the crash, but from the weight of eyes already turning toward him, already believing the worst. Outside, the young man's finger remained fixed like an arrow, his voice rising with unearned certainty. "This is your fault," he declared, his words echoing against the walls of the stunned street. "All of it." Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand still gripping the steering wheel. Around him, the dust was settling, but inside him, a storm had just begun. The silence after the crash shattered the moment the young man's voice filled the street. His anger wasn't quiet or cautious. It was a performance, sharp and commanding, meant to dominate the space. He wasn't paying attention. He shouted, jabbing a finger toward Daniel like a weapon. He came out of nowhere. The words tore through the stunned air, carrying further than the smoke that still curled from the crumpled cars. His tone was polished with the confidence of someone who had always been believed before, someone who wore entitlement as comfortably as his expensive jacket, Daniel's ears rang from the impact, but the accusations cut deeper than the crash. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt, his hands trembling as they brushed shards of glass from his lap. He stepped out of the car, legs unsteady, the world tilting slightly as he found his footing. His sedan sat mangled at the curb, its once ordinary frame now scarred and broken. Already, people had begun to gather. Shopkeepers stepped outside their doors, pedestrians halted mid-errand, and children on bicycles lingered at the corner, their laughter replaced with wide-eyed silence. Strangers' voices rose in low, curious tones, murmuring theories. Filling the air with half-formed judgments, the young man seized their attention with ease. He gestured dramatically to his gleaming sports car, now dented and scraped, as if it were a fallen hero. His face twisted with practiced outrage. "Look at this. Look what he's done. Do you know how much this car costs? And this man just crashed into me." Daniel drew in a steadying breath, his chest still aching from the seatbelt's restraint. His voice, when it came, was quiet but firm, carrying a truth he hoped would rise above the noise. "I had the green light," he said softly, his tone edged with disbelief. "He ran through. I stopped. I looked. He didn't." But his words seemed to vanish into the wind. The crowd's response wasn't shock or sympathy, it was suspicion. Heads tilted, brows furrowed, lips pressed into skeptical lines. A few exchanged glances that carried more weight than words, their silence louder than any defense Daniel could offer. One man in the crowd muttered just loud enough to be heard. Always the careless drivers, never watching the road. Another shook her head, eyes sliding over Daniel's modest car and then his face, her expression a verdict already passed. Looks like he wasn't paying attention. The sting hit harder than the crash itself. It wasn't just the accusation of one wealthy stranger, it was the chorus of assumptions rising around him, the invisible scales tipping against him without evidence. Daniel could feel it in their eyes, in their whispers. He wasn't being heard. He was being judged. The young man stepped closer, his voice booming with confidence. "I was driving carefully. I followed every rule. He just swerved in reckless, careless, dangerous." His words carried the weight of certainty, as though volume alone made him righteous. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to shout, to match the man's volume, to defend himself with the force he felt in his chest, but that wasn't who he was. Instead, he stood straighter, shoulders squared, his voice low but unwavering. "I didn't swerve. I didn't rush. I had the right of way." Yet the silence that followed felt cold, unsympathetic. The crowd didn't lean toward him. They leaned away, folding further into the young man's narrative. To them, wealth looked like credibility. A tailored jacket looked like truth. And Daniel, shaken, ordinary, with glass still clinging to his shirt, looked like guilt. The weight pressed down on him, heavier than the crash, heavier than the sting in his chest. It wasn't just about proving his innocence anymore, it was about surviving the familiar, suffocating feeling of being disbelieved before he'd even been heard. Daniel's hands curled into fists at his sides, not from anger, but from the effort of holding himself together. The storm outside was loud, but the storm inside him was louder still. And as the crowd shifted, as whispers turned to quiet nods of agreement with the young man's claims, Daniel felt the harsh truth settle deep into his bones. In this moment, his word weighed less than the shine of a broken sports car. The rising tension of the street broke with the sudden wail of sirens. Blue and red lights reflected against windows, washing over the gathered faces like a warning. A patrol car pulled up to the curb, its engine still humming as two officers stepped out, their presence shifting the crowd from curious murmurs to expectant silence. Daniel stood by his battered sedan, his breathing steady but shallow. His hands rested loosely at his sides, though his chest still ached with every inhale. The young man, meanwhile, straightened his jacket as though preparing for a stage performance. His scowl melted into something smoother, controlled indignation. The kind designed to win favor. "Officers, thank God you're here," he began before they even approached, his voice carrying the ease of someone accustomed to being listened to. He strode forward with confident steps, gesturing grandly to his crushed sports car. This man, he wasn't paying attention. He came barreling out, didn't even stop. "Look what he's done to my car." The officers glanced briefly at the twisted vehicles, but their eyes lingered longer on the young man's tailored clothes, his polished shoes, the gleaming watch on his wrist. He exuded money, influence, the kind of presence that too often bent narratives in his favor. Daniel swallowed hard, watching the exchange with quiet unease. He knew this pattern, he had seen it before, lived it before. He could already feel the invisible scales tipping, not weighed by truth but by appearances. One officer finally turned toward him. "Sir, is that correct?" he asked, his tone professional, but already laced with doubt. Daniel straightened, meeting the officer's gaze with tired eyes. "No," he said calmly, his voice low but steady. "I had the green light. I stopped. I looked. He came through the red, far too fast." The young man scoffed loudly, shaking his head as though the very words were absurd. "Unbelievable," he muttered to the crowd, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's trying to pin this on me." A ripple of agreement stirred in the bystanders. Whispers reignited, short, sharp, dangerous. Daniel caught fragments. "Reckless. Not surprised. Careless drivers." The sting pierced deeper than glass shards ever could. The officer scribbled notes, his pen moving slower when Daniel spoke, quicker when the young man repeated his accusations with flair. "He came out of nowhere," the young man insisted again, his tone practiced, his expression flawless. "I've been driving these streets for years. I'm careful. Look at my car, officer. Look at what he did." Daniel's voice trembled now, not from guilt, but from the crushing weight of being unheard. "I didn't come out of nowhere," he said softly, almost to himself. He lifted his chin slightly, steadying his tone. "I've always been careful. I was careful today." He ran the light, but his words seemed to sink into silence, swallowed by the louder voice, the more convincing display. The officer closed his notebook, his jaw tight. His eyes flicked once more to Daniel, then to the crowd, then finally back to the young man, whose performance had convinced nearly everyone. Doubt lingered in his gaze, but it was faint, fleeting. Daniel felt his chest constrict. His innocence, his truth, seemed fragile against the towering weight of assumption pressing down on him. The sirens had faded, but in their place was the drumbeat of injustice, steady and relentless. As the young man stood taller, his confidence unshaken, Daniel whispered a prayer beneath his breath, so faint it barely reached his own ears. "God, please, let the truth come out." The tension on the street had thickened, heavy as the dust still hanging in the air. The young man stood tall beside his crumpled sports car, every word he spoke dripping with conviction, every gesture commanding the crowd's agreement. Daniel, by contrast, looked smaller in their eyes, though his frame had not changed, though his truth remained unbroken. He seemed dwarfed by the weight of disbelief pressing down on him. The officers exchanged glances, the younger one flipping through his notes as if searching for clarity that wasn't there. The older officer shifted his gaze toward Daniel's dented sedan, then back at the flashy sports car. Even without speaking, his hesitation showed wealth had a way of skewing the scales. The murmurs of the crowd were growing louder, some even shaking their heads at Daniel as though the verdict had already been written. His heart ached with the familiar sting of being judged by appearances, not facts. And then, cutting through the hum of whispers, a voice rose from the edge of the crowd. "Wait," a man said, pointing toward the corner of the intersection. "Isn't there a traffic camera up there?" The shift was immediate. Heads turned, eyes following the direction of his finger to the gray pole standing tall at the curb. At its peak, A small black lens pointed toward the road, steady and unblinking. A silent witness to the chaos that had just unfolded. The officers froze for a moment, then followed the gaze upward. Their expressions changed not drastically, but enough. For the first time, certainty cracked. The young man's confidence faltered, just briefly. His eyes darted toward the pole, and something flickered across his face. Fear, quickly masked with indignation. He forced a laugh, shaking his head dismissively. A camera? He scoffed. Even if there is one, who knows if it's working? Probably hasn't recorded anything in years. But his voice had lost its edge, his tone thinner, now less commanding. Daniel noticed. His hands, still trembling slightly from the crash, loosened their grip. For the first time since the collision, a flicker of hope touched his chest. He followed the gaze of the crowd, staring at the small camera above the street, like it was a lifeline. The younger officer stepped aside. Pulling out his radio, he spoke. Quickly, his words clipped but precise. A request for the intersection footage. The older officer crossed his arms, watching the young man more closely now, as if sensing the subtle cracks in his performance. The crowd, too, shifted. Where before they had leaned toward the wealthy driver's story, now curiosity tugged them into neutrality. They whispered to one another, some glancing back at Daniel with uncertainty instead of outright doubt. The invisible scale had wavered, even if only slightly. The young man noticed that too. His jaw tightened, his posture stiffened, and his voice rose again in a desperate attempt to reassert control. Listen, officers, I told you what happened. I was driving carefully, he wasn't paying attention. Do you really need some old camera to see what's obvious? He laughed again, too quickly, his words tumbling out like stones skipping across water. But his laughter didn't echo. It fell flat. Daniel stayed silent, his dignity steady as he stood by his battered car. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to perform. The truth was no longer buried under voices, it was climbing its way out, carried on the lens of an unblinking witness. For the first time since the crash, the street felt different. Suspense hung in the air, heavier than accusation, thicker than doubt. The crowd was no longer so sure. The officers were no longer so quick to decide. And Daniel, still bruised, still shaken, felt a quiet strength rising inside him. The truth was close. He could feel it. The crowd's murmurs dimmed as the younger officer pressed his radio tight to his ear, listening intently. A few tense moments passed, long, heavy seconds that stretched like hours. Daniel stood still, every breath measured, his eyes fixed on the officer as though the truth itself hung on that device. Finally, the officer nodded once, his expression unreadable. They've got the footage, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the street like a gavel striking wood. The young man shifted uneasily, tugging at the cuff of his sleeve. He tried to force another confident smile, but it faltered under the weight of so many watching eyes. Within minutes, a tablet was brought forward, the intersection's camera feed loaded and ready. The officers huddled first, their eyes scanning the playback in silence. The crowd leaned forward instinctively, as though their anticipation might bend the air and pull the truth closer. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. His palms were damp, his breath shallow. He prayed silently, not for vengeance, not for pride, but simply to be seen. And then, the screen lit up with the moment in question. The footage was clear. Crystal clear. Daniel's sedan rolled calmly into the frame, slowing as it approached the intersection. The light above shone a steady green. His car paused briefly, his head turning as he checked left and right, then continued forward at a cautious pace. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Then, like a beast unleashed, the sports car streaked into the frame. It barreled through the glaring red light without hesitation, its polished body gleaming under the sun, its speed reckless, almost arrogant. The crash unfolded again, but this time, not through noise and chaos, through the cold, impartial lens. of truth. Gasps spread among the onlookers. Some covered their mouths. Others whispered to each other, voices edged with shame for the assumptions they had made just minutes earlier. Daniel's chest swelled not with triumph, but with vindication. The weight pressing down on him lifted, replaced with something fragile but profound. Relief. The young man's face drained of color. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came. His eyes darted wildly, searching for escape, for excuses, for anything that might twist the narrative back into his favor. But the footage was merciless. The camera revealed more. As the sports car sped into the intersection, the driver's head was tilted downward, his hand glowing faintly with the blue light of a phone screen. He wasn't just reckless, he was distracted, texting as the world around him blurred. The officer paused the video, his finger pointing directly at the frame. The evidence was undeniable. The crowd shifted again, this time their stares piercing not Daniel, but the young man. Judgment, once hastily thrown at the careful driver, now swung back with double force at the wealthy pretender. Daniel exhaled slowly, his eyes closing for a brief moment. He hadn't needed to scream, hadn't needed to beg. The truth had spoken. For him, louder than any accusation. Still, the revelation was not finished. The officer replayed the footage in slow motion. As the cars collided, a small object rolled across the passenger seat of the sports car, a bottle. The glass glinted under the sunlight before tumbling to the floor, its contents sloshing against the neck. The murmurs turned into a collective gasp. This wasn't just distraction. This was recklessness fueled by something darker. The young man's mask cracked completely now. His voice, once so loud, shrank into a mutter. That doesn't prove anything. That's not, but his. Words were drowned out. The truth had claimed the stage, and it needed no defense. For Daniel, time seemed to still. He stood straighter, his bruised body aching but his spirit unshaken. The truth had not only cleared his name, it had revealed the lie for what it truly was. Fragile, temporary, destined to crumble under the weight of reality. The crowd, the officers, even the city itself seemed to see him differently now, not as the accused, not as the careless man they had assumed him to be, but as what he truly was, careful, patient, dignified. And for the first time since the crash, Daniel allowed himself a small breath of peace. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that made every sound sharper, the shuffle of feet on pavement, the hum of an idling engine, the rustle of leaves in the warm afternoon air. All eyes were fixed on the young man, whose confidence had dissolved like smoke in the wind. His tailored suit no longer made him powerful. It only seemed to hang awkwardly on his frame, a costume for a role he could no longer play. One officer cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Sir, we'll need you to stay here while we confirm a few details." The young man bristled, his voice high-pitched and trembling. "This is ridiculous. My father's a lawyer. Do you even know who I am?" His words rang hollow, more desperate than commanding. Daniel stood quietly to the side, his hands still trembling faintly from the shock of the collision. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his steady gaze followed the scene. He had no need to protest anymore. The footage had spoken for him. But then came the detail no one had expected. The officer who had been reviewing the footage leaned closer to the tablet, his brows knitting together. "Wait, look here." He zoomed in on the slowed replay. The bottle that had rolled across the sports car's seat was more than a shadow. It was a distinctive glass container, its label catching the light just enough to be legible. The officer straightened, his tone grave. "That's alcohol." The crowd reacted instantly. Gasps, whispers. A low wave of disapproval swept through the people gathered, as if the truth had just sunk deeper than they thought possible. The young man's face drained further. He shook his head violently. That was nothing. It's not mine." His voice cracked, betraying him, but another voice rose from the back of the crowd. a middle-aged shopkeeper who had been standing quietly until now. "I saw him earlier today," the man said firmly. "He bought 2 bottles from the corner store down the street. Shoved them into his car before driving off. Thought he was clever." The murmurs turned into a storm. The young man stumbled back, his words unraveling into fragments. "No, I wasn't drinking. The officers didn't wait for excuses." One of them moved closer, his tone professional but edged with steel. "Sir, we're going to have to conduct a sobriety test." The once proud driver, who only minutes ago had pointed his finger at Daniel with such authority, now stood small and cornered, his arrogance crumbled into panic. His protests grew weaker, swallowed by the crowd's collective disdain, Daniel's. Heart pounded as he watched it unfold. It wasn't joy he felt, it was something more complex, more bittersweet. Relief, yes. Vindication, certainly, but beneath it all, there was sorrow. Sorrow that it had to come to this, that truth had to claw its way through lies and prejudice before anyone would see it. The test was swift, the result undeniable. The young man had been drinking. The officer's voice rang clear as he delivered the verdict. "You are under arrest for driving under the influence and reckless endangerment." The crowd shifted again, this time murmuring approval. Some even turned their eyes toward Daniel, their expression softer, tinged with guilt for their earlier assumptions. Daniel felt the weight lift fully now. For the first time since the crash, he allowed himself to inhale deeply, the air filling his lungs like a balm. He wasn't triumphant, he was simply free. As the young man was led away, still sputtering broken excuses, Daniel remained by his car. The dented metal and shattered glass reflected the violence of the moment, but also the resilience that had carried him through it. A woman in the crowd, her voice trembling, stepped closer. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have judged so quickly." Others nodded, their eyes lowered in shame. Daniel met her gaze and gave a small, weary smile. "The truth always finds its way," he said softly. His words weren't bitter, but steady, as though he'd carried this lesson long before today. And as the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street, Daniel stood tall, not just as a man cleared of blame, but as a reminder that dignity can withstand even the fiercest storm of injustice. The street eventually cleared, but the memory of what had happened lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Daniel sat on the curb for a moment, his head bowed, hands clasped together as if in silent prayer. His car, dented and broken, stood behind him like a wounded companion. Around him, pieces of shattered glass glimmered in the sunlight, tiny fragments of chaos reflecting an afternoon that had spiraled out of control. He could still hear the echoes of the crowd accusations whispered, blame thrown recklessly, the sting of judgment that had pierced him deeper than the crash itself. That was the wound that hurt the most, one that no repair shop could ever fix. People hadn't just doubted his driving. They had doubted his honesty, his worth, his very character without a moment's hesitation, and all because of who he was. Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing the ache in his chest to soften. He reminded himself of the moment the truth had been revealed, when the cameras had shown the reality no one wanted to believe. He had been right all along, careful, cautious, responsible, yet still, he had been painted as the villain before. A single fact was laid bare. That was the cruelest part of injustice. It always came first, loud and certain. Truth came later, slow and quiet, having to fight its way uphill. An officer approached him then, kneeling slightly so their eyes met. "Mr. Harris," the officer said gently, "we'll file a full report, and your insurance will get all the evidence it needs. You have nothing to worry about." Daniel nodded, though he knew the officer's reassurance could only stretch so far. Paperwork could fix financial troubles, but it couldn't erase the sting of being falsely condemned in front of strangers. He offered the officer a polite thank you, then rose to his feet, dusting off his pants as the weight of exhaustion settled into his bones. The wealthy young man, now handcuffed in the back of a police car, glared at him through the window. But Daniel didn't meet his gaze with hatred. He simply looked once, then turned away. Revenge or anger wasn't what he carried in that moment. Only a tired but unshakable dignity. As he walked away from the wreckage, a thought settled in his heart. How many others had stood where he stood today? How many voices had been silenced because no one bothered to listen, because judgment had already spoken louder than truth? The answer, he knew, was too many. Later that evening, as the sun melted into a warm orange horizon, Daniel sat on his porch with a cup of tea. The day had been long, bruising, but he felt something steady within him. He replayed the scene in his mind, not the crash, not the shouting accusations, but the moment the footage appeared. The moment truth broke through. That was the memory he chose to keep. He knew life would go on. People would forget the details. Some would remember the crash only as gossip, never caring about the lesson. But Daniel would carry it as a reminder. Dignity doesn't come from being believed. It comes from standing firm in who you are, even when the world doubts you. And for anyone who cared to listen, his story whispered a truth that demanded to be remembered. Do not rush to judgment. Do not let bias blind you. Truth is patient. And in the end, it will always surface. That night, as the first stars blinked awake in the sky, Daniel finally allowed himself a small smile. The world had tried to strip him of his honesty, but it had failed. Because no accusation, no whisper, no prejudice could ever erase the truth of who he was. And that was his victory.